Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Kitchell, and today we're going to be going over the Daniel 7 Kingdoms. For today's presentation, we're going to be going over 3 of the kingdoms. Last week, we went over the 4th kingdom, which was the Umayyad Caliphate in Muawiyah. Today, we're going to be going over the 3 other beasts in Daniel 7. First one is going to be Napoleon III, which is France. Part 2 is Kaiser Wilhelm, which is Germany. And part 3 is Queen Victoria, which is Great Britain. And so, here's the description the Bible gives us for the first 3 beasts. 4 great beasts, each different from the other, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was the second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up, eat your fill of flesh." After that, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back, it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had heads on, and it was given authority to rule. And so, there are 4 beasts in here. We went over this one last week, but just to refresh everybody's memory. After that, in my vision, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the other beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the 10 horns, there before me was another horn, a little one which came up among them. And 3 of the other first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like a human and a mouth that spoke boastfully. If you remember last week, this was the Umayyad Caliphate in Muawiyah, and this is the Islamic Civil War, which brought him to power. So we're going to be going over the first 3 beasts today. Remember, biblical prophecy is written symbolically, not literally. So here's what Daniel says for the 4 beasts. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth, but the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. And so today we're going to be going over the 3 other beasts because we've already gone over the 4th one. But one thing we need to go over in Daniel chapter 7, it uses the phrase Ancient of Days. It uses this phrase 3 times. And this is the only time in the Bible the phrase Ancient of Days shows up. And it says, Daniel chapter 7, verse 9, "As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and his wheels were ablaze." A few verses later, it says, "In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence." It says a few verses later, "As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced his judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom." So this says the Ancient of Days is going to be the one who's going to sit in the throne and is going to pass judgment on these 4 kingdoms. That's what that says here. In Behold's letter to Napoleon III, it says, "Wert thou to incline thy inner ear unto all created things, thou wouldst hear. The Ancient of Days has come in his great glory. Everything celebrates the praise of its Lord. Some have known God and remember him. Others remember him, yet know him not. Thus have we set our decree in the perspicuous tablets." So this is right here, the phrase Ancient of Days is used. This is Baha'u'llah saying, "I am the Ancient of Days, and here is your judgment." And this was a letter that he wrote to Napoleon III. And for the first beast that we're going to be going over, it says, "The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it." So what we're going to do is we're going to go over French history. Then we're going to go into the symbolism and break down Behold's letter to world leaders. And we're going to do this for each of the leaders. So we're going to start off with a man named Napoleon I. And this is different than Napoleon III, because Napoleon I was the one who set up the first French Empire, and he declared himself Emperor of France. And this is where the Napoleonic Wars come from. And the symbol that he used for his empire was the French imperial eagle right here. That's the eagle you see in the symbolism with the wings coming out of the line. And so we're going to watch a video here. This is a day by day of the Napoleonic Wars. What I want everyone to get out of here is just how vast the French Empire became, and just all the series of wars that came out under the Napoleonic Wars. That's what you're going to get from here. So here's the video. All right, so we need to see how there's just how vast his Napoleonic wars were, because Napoleon's empire stretched all the way from Spain all the way to Russia. And so that was a legacy that Napoleon I left. Now we come to Napoleon III. Napoleon III was nephew of Napoleon I through his first wife, Josephine. Josephine and Napoleon I did not have any children together. So Napoleon III was the heir to the French Empire until Emperor Napoleon I remarried Marie of Austria, and they had a child named Napoleon II. Then after the fall of the French monarchy, after the fall of the French Empire, the French monarchy was reestablished, and then Napoleon II and others in line passed away, leaving Napoleon III heir to the French Empire. However, with the fall of the first French Empire, Napoleon I, the Bourbon monarchy, which is the French monarchy, they were reestablished, and they began the Second White Terror. And the Second White Terror was the French monarchy killing and imprisoning anybody who was loyal to Napoleon I, because they were still fearful of his legacy and they did not want another rebellion taking place. So Napoleon III was exiled to modern-day Germany and eventually resided in Switzerland. So he did not grow up in France. He grew up in exile because the French monarchy did not want the French Empire being reestablished. So Napoleon III as a person, there's a few things that are noted about him. He had two loves in this world, women and power. Now, during my entire presentation, I just want you to assume that he's having affairs and has mistresses at every point in the presentation. That way I don't have to keep repeating myself. It's just going to be easier to go through for Plus, the other thing he had a love of was power, because what he wanted to do is he wanted to continue the glory of Napoleon I. Because if you remember, Napoleon's empire stretched from Spain all the way to Russia. And so he wanted that glory. And because of this, he was also a romantic revolutionary. And since he was living in exile, he was also a passionate supporter of the Italian cause of freedom. Because at this point in history, Italy was not a unified country. Italy was just a series of city-states that were warring amongst each other. But it's during this time that he also received a reputation for being a loose cannon, because what he did in his uprising in 1830, what he did is he got the Italian flag. He decided he's going riding down the streets of Rome on a horse, waving the flag. Well, the problem was Italy was not a unified country. There was revolutionary fervor, and Vatican, the papal states, were the ones who controlled it. So by doing that, he's literally undermining the papal states. Long story short, it starts a riot and he gets in the skirmish with the papal guards and he ends up being exiled from Italy. So because of just his poor planning and poor decision on his part, he received a reputation for being a loose cannon. And this happened in the year 1830. But also during this time, the Bourbon king, who's the French monarchy, he passed away, and the French king was the one who deposed Napoleon I. And his son, Charles X, was the one who took over in France. Charles X was a repressive religious bigot. What he did is he created a government of the priests, by the priests, and for the priests. And so what he ended up doing is he ended up alienating a lot of people who would otherwise have supported him. And so, plus, the thing was, before the French Revolution took place, the French religion was heavily tied in to the French monarchy. So when the French Revolution took place, the French church took a lot of the brunt of the revolution. So what Charles X did by creating a government of the clergy, by the clergy, and for the clergy, he's reverting France back to his pre-revolutionary time, which was a very unpopular thing to do. And so Charles X was so unpopular that by the year 1830, there was rebellion and he was forced to abdicate and a new king was crowned. And now Napoleon III, remember, he has his romantic revolutionary ideals and he believed it was his destiny to rule France as an emperor. He was watching what was going on. And so what he wanted to do is he wanted to do a bloodless coup like his uncle Napoleon I did. Because if you remember back to the video, the first time Napoleon I was deposed of, he was exiled to the island of Elba. Then he escaped, and then he did a bloodless coup and set himself up as Emperor of France, deposing of the French monarchy, and then he ruled for 100 days before he was deposed of. Napoleon III has similar ambitions. He wanted to do something the same way. So he decided that, hey, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a bloodless coup, and I'm going to set myself up as Emperor of France. So in 1836, Napoleon III made his move in Strasbourg. What he wanted to do is he wanted to send out decrees declaring himself emperor. The military, many of who still fought under his uncle, were going to rally behind him, and the people who hated the French monarchy were rallied behind him, that he could ride in and do a bloodless coup like his uncle did. That was the plan. And while doing this, he's going to be wielding the French imperial eagle, which has lost strong symbolic value to it. Well, it was a plan that was not very well thought out. Because for this plan, the only person who really supported him that had any influence was a colonel. And the only reason his colonel supported him is because his mistress wouldn't sleep with him unless he supported Napoleon III. Because what happened was Napoleon III slept with his colonel's mistress, so this colonel's mistress was in love with Napoleon III. So with his support, he's going to set himself up as Emperor of France. That's the plan. So the time came, he crossed the border into France, and he declared himself the Emperor of France. The first thing he did was go to the general's barracks, so general's office. He walks into the general's office, declares himself the Emperor of France. The general's pretty confused about what's going on here. He's like, who in the world are you? So the general does not support him, so Napoleon III has the general arrested. So he decides what he's going to do is he's going to go to the soldiers' barracks, and then he's going to declare himself to be Emperor of France, and the soldiers are going to support him and march on Paris with him. Well, what ended up happening is he walked into the soldiers' barracks, and the soldiers were genuinely confused about what was going on. They thought he was they thought it was a joke at first. They're like, no, he's not actually the French emperor. He's someone else just claiming to be him. And eventually decided that he's a traitor and needs to be arrested. So this whole coup attempt that's supposed to set himself up as Emperor of France only lasted 2 hours before he was arrested, and then he was exiled to America. But when he was exiled to America, the ship ended up taking the long way around to America. So they went down across Africa to South America, up the coast of South America, then to America. And so this trip took a very long time to get there. And then he's living in exile in America during this time after his failed coup attempt. But while he was living in exile in America, he received a letter that his mother was living in Switzerland and she was dying. So he had to go, so he went to go see his mother before she died, that we could see each other one last time. So without getting proper permission, he got in a ship, he sailed from America to London. And so he didn't get permission from the president of America during this time. He just went out and did it. So he sails to London to get his passport to Switzerland, which he gets successful in doing. And then he gets to Switzerland to see his dying mother, and they are able to see each other one more time before his mother passes away. Well, the French monarchy did not like it that Napoleon III was staying in Switzerland, because even though Napoleon III at this point had a reputation for being a loose cannon, he was still a threat. Because under him was the legacy of Napoleon I of the French Empire, and the French monarchy was they were terrified of that. And they knew that even though Napoleon III had a failed coup attempt that was a pretty miserable attempt, he still wielded power among the people, and they were still scared of that. And so what happened is the French monarchy decided to start making a big deal in the courts of Europe about Napoleon III staying in Switzerland. They want him out. So what Napoleon III decides to do is he's going to play the gossip game and the European courts game. And he starts making a big deal about his time staying in Europe, coming very close to a confrontation between France and Switzerland. And so at the last minute before a confrontation happens between France and Switzerland, he announces that, I'm just going to leave Switzerland to avoid a conflict. That way I'm saving everyone in Europe from a huge international incident. But he was the one who created the incident. So effectively, he lied to get out of Switzerland. And by doing that, he made himself a national hero against the French monarchy. And his name is now on in every court of Europe now knows his name and that he's a relevant factor. So even though he's the one who created this incident, he came out as someone who looked like a hero after it. And so what he did is he returned to London, and this is when he began to plan his next takeover of France, because he's still a romantic revolutionary, and he still believed it was his destiny to rule over France as an emperor, like his uncle did. And so here was the next attempt for his power. The next attempt, he was going to launch a coup in France, and he was going to do it from England in the year 1840. The coup was going to be in a French city known as Boulogne, because he wouldn't here during this time at this location, because Napoleon I, if you remember, he died in exile. his body was returning to France during this time. And so what he wanted to do is he wanted to make sure that he was landing in France when the body of Napoleon III was returning, because there's going to be very strong symbolic value behind this. And that's what he wants to, and that's what he wants to use to ride on his path to power. And he made sure that he had allies in this time. He made sure that there's people in the French military who supported him this time. So he's doing a much better job actually planning out this coup attempt, and there's a good chance it's going to work. But Murphy's Law, it didn't go according to plan, because he thought he was being followed, so the ship ended up leaving England late. And so when he got to the coast of France, the military officers that supported him were not at their positions. Instead, who was there were people who did not support him. So when he lands in France, rather than being greeted by soldiers who support him, he's greeted by people who doesn't support him. He has those people taken prisoner. And Napoleon III's advisors say, you need to kill these people. That way they don't tell on you, to the French monarchy. But Napoleon III wanted to do a bloodless coup, so he said, no, we are not going to kill these guys. We're just going to make them promise me that they will not tell on me to the French monarchy. And those two people that he arrested, they said, yes, we won't tell on you. And Napoleon III let them go. But as soon as they walked away, they ran out and told on him. So now he got spotted at this point. So things aren't going according to plan. And he has people in the French military who oppose him coming out there. So long story short, what Napoleon III ends up doing is he orders the French soldiers who don't support him that you need to obey my commands, and they tell him no. So he does it, he pulls out a gun and he shoots one of them. Well, now everybody who even supports him they're not going to follow him anymore because he just shot their buddy. And so this whole coup attempt ends up being a total failure again, and it's over within 24 hours. And rather than being exiled to America this time he ends up in prison for 6 years. And so after staying in 6 prison after his failed second coup attempt, he flees to London, and to where he decides that he's going to try again to do another coup to declare himself Emperor of France. This time he decides he's going to wait for events to happen. And he's going to gather money, resources, and allies while he waits for his attempt at a coup. Now, 1848, that was the year of revolutions in Europe. This is the year when social upheavals began to sweep the continent of Europe. And it was also this year that the King of France abdicated in response to an uprising because France got the worst of the social upheaval. And so during this time, the French middle class took over, forming the Second French Republic. Notice, not the French Empire. Napoleon III wants to make himself Emperor of France. This is a French Republic. So no, he does not support this. Still, he sees an opportunity to come back to France. So Napoleon III sails from London to Paris to assume power. But he cannot assume power as an emperor yet. And so he had to go in an election, and he was elected to the head of 4 departments, but left Paris due to anti-Republican statements. This ended up working out for him in the end, because after he left, the French lower class rebelled against the French middle class, and the rebellion was put down. But since he was not there during the rebellion putting it down, he came out looking like a hero for it. And so that a lot of people began to coalesce around him because he had the name, he was elected in previous departments, and he was looking like a national hero at that point. And so he was elected as president of France during this point, but he is not satisfied with being president of France. He wants to be emperor of France. And so when he is president of France, he chose the title Prince President. And while he's president, he spent a lot of money because he loved to rule off a whim, and he loved to live in luxury. And so he kept spending a lot more money. And so he kept going to the French legislature, trying to get them to vote him more money. And they're telling him, no, you need to learn to live within your means, like the other rulers of Europe do. Plus, the other thing, he wanted to be emperor of France. He didn't want to be president of France. So he's also going to the French legislature to have his powers expanded. But the French legislature kept telling him, no, we are the Second French Republic. We are not a French empire like your uncle was. So he basically had a choice. Do I just live within my means, or do I plan a coup and overthrow the Second French Republic and create the Second French Empire? Because the thing about France during that time is but they also had him a term limit on being president of France. His term limit was coming up. So do I just accept it and leave, or do I make myself emperor of France? And he decided that he's going to make himself emperor of France. And to do this, he's going to stage a coup on December 1851. There was a lot of symbolism behind this time, because first one, this one, Napoleon I declared himself emperor of France. So there's symbolic value behind this. Secondly, this was the anniversary of the Battle of Austerlitz, and this was the greatest victory of Napoleon I. So there's also a lot of military symbolism behind this. And so this is when he decides that he's going to declare a coup to declare himself emperor of France. Now, when he's getting ready for the coup, he makes sure only a very few people knew of what he was planning, because he did not want his enemies getting wind of what he was doing and stopping his coup attempt. And so December 1851 came around. Then he told everyone the night of what he was planning. He sent his military out and those loyal to him, and he staged a coup declaring himself emperor of France. And this is when he became, and yet this was a successful coup. However, not everyone supported the coup, because after he declared himself emperor of France, many people still wanted the Second French Republic, because this was the end of the Second French Republic and the beginning of the Second French Empire. And so there was a lot of opposition against him. So he pulled all the military and those loyal to him out of Paris, and he let his opposition come out and flood the streets of Paris. Then he sent the military and those loyal to him back in, and they just went through and cleared all those who opposed him. And during this fighting, it killed over 400 people in Paris, and over 27,000 were arrested. And that's how he was able to secure himself as emperor of France. And then after that, no one was willing to come out and oppose him. And he was widely condemned as a traitor who betrayed the Republic, because, like his uncle ended the First French Republic and formed the First French Empire. He just ended the Second French Republic and formed the Second French Empire. And he made sure that there was an election that went out, and he made sure that the results showed that people voted in favor of him. So with this, he was now the undisputed emperor of France. And this is the beginning of the Second French Empire. Now, one thing that every empire needs to do is they need to expand the empire and get a military victory. And he decided that he was going to start a war to do this. So what he did is he declared himself that he is the protector of the Catholic Church. And when you go to Jerusalem, there are a lot of holy sites there. And the Orthodox, they held the keys to holy places. So he decided that he's going to start a war over who holds a set of keys to the holy places. Yes, that's literally what this war was fought over. There's a set of keys. Who holds a set of keys to it? Is it the Orthodox Church holds a set of keys, or is it the Catholic Church? That's literally what this war was fought over, because he wanted to just start a war that way he can declare he's the protector of the Catholic Church. That way he can get a victory for the Second French Empire and expand the empire. So what he did was he started a war with Russia, who was Orthodox, and got the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire to support him in the war. This was a completely unnecessary war. And so he had his nephew, who was leading the French Empire into the war against the Russians. However, his nephew was unable to fight the war, and so his nephew ended up returning to France. And Napoleon I was an emperor general, so not having a Bonaparte in the field was a really big insult. So Napoleon III decided that he was going to lead the French Empire in Crimea against the Russians, like his uncle would do. But rather than join the French military in Crimea, at the last minute, he decided that he was going to London to go be with Great Britain to live in luxury during this time. So he didn't even lead the French military in this war. And in this war, 750,000 people died in it over to decide who holds a set of keys. Literally, that's literally what happened here. Totally unnecessary. But at the end of this war, the peace talks were held in Paris, which gave France a lot of international prestige, and this went down as a French victory. So it was good in that regard for the French Empire, but 750,000 dead over who holds a set of keys was really an unnecessary war. And so this brings us to the next step. Now he was able to get the victory. And during his time, he was almost assassinated by Italians. Soon afterwards, he's almost assassinated by Italians who wanted a French Republican uprising. Because as I said, Italy was not a united country behind this point. So with these Italians, the thought that if we assassinate the French Empire, the French Republicans are going to rise up and create the Third French Republic, which is going to cause the Italian Republicans to rise up and unify Italy. That was the idea. So they attempted to assassinate Napoleon III while he's going to an opera house. Well, Napoleon III did not like being assassinated. I mean, nobody would, but he took this to a different level. He decided what he was going to do to protect himself. He was going to start a war in Italy to cover up Italy with the sole purpose of protecting himself. Here's the problem with that. Austria had a lot of influence in Italy, and he was also declaring to be the protector of the Catholic Church, and the papacy, the papal states were also in Italy. So what he did is he went to war with the Austrians to remove Austrian influence in Italy to protect himself from future assassination attempts. So they fought 2 battles with the Austrians. Both of them were a victory for the French Empire, defeating Austria and removing all Austrian influence in Italy. But based off a win, Napoleon III decided he didn't want to fight a war anymore. So he ended up signing a really bad deal with the Austrians. That way he could go home early. So despite the Crimean War being fought for his own selfish interests, and this war being fought for his own selfish interests, 1860 is still considered the height of the power for Napoleon III. So there's symptoms things are going to go bad, but they have not hit those symptoms yet. Which brings us to the Mexican War, the next major item in here. Because Napoleon III decided that he wanted a monarchist ally in America. So he wanted the Archduke Maximilian crowned king of Mexico. Well, Archduke Maximilian didn't decide that he wanted to be king at this point, but that did not stop Napoleon III from pushing for a war and pushing for the monarchy of Maximilian before he was even ready. So this started a revolution in Mexico, which initially the French and King Maximilian were successful. Maximilian was crowned king and he ruled for a while. But then what happened was Napoleon III changed his mind and decided that he was going to pull his forces out of Mexico. And when he pulled his forces out of Mexico, then King Maximilian was overthrown and he was executed. And this was all done based just off of whims from Napoleon III. And so he initially had his monarchist ally in Mexico, but he changed his mind, pulled him out. So he no longer has a monarchist ally in Mexico. And this is where we come to Baha'u'llah's letter to Napoleon III. He said, "Oh, King of Paris, tell the priests to ring the bells no longer. By God, the true one, the most mighty bell hath appeared in the form of who is the most great name. And the fingers of the will of thy Lord most exalted, the most high, toll out in the heaven of immortality, in his name, the all glorious. Thus have the mighty verses of thy Lord been again sent down unto thee, that thou mayst arise to remember God, the creator of earth and heaven. In these days when all the tribes of the earth had mourned, and the foundations of the city had trembled, and the dust of irreligion had enwrapped all men, except such as God, the all-knowing, the all-wise, was pleased to share." So he's telling the priests, do not ring the bells any longer. I am the return of Christ. I have come. You need to start worshiping me. That's why he starts off by writing his letter to Napoleon III. And it goes in to say, in these days when all the tribes of the earth had mourned, and the foundations of cities have trembled, and the dust of irreligion hath enwrapped all men, except such as God, the all-knowing, the all-wise, was pleased to spare. Because when the French Revolution happened, well, initially, it really went after the church heavily, because what the French church did is they tied themselves into the monarchy. So one of the French monarchy's biggest allies was the French church. And so when these French revolutions happened, that led to a lot of like atheism, agnosticism, lack of belief in God. So when he's saying that the dust of irreligion had enwrapped all men, he's referring to France right there, when a lot of non-religion became, and a lot of secularism became very dominant in France. So coming to my part 2 of the letter. O king, we heard one of the words of thou didst utter in answer to the Tsar of Russia, concerning the decision made regarding the Crimean War. Thy Lord verily knoweth, is informed of all. Thou didst say, I lay asleep upon my couch when the cry of the oppressed who were drowned in the Black Sea wakened to me. This is what we heard thee say, and verily thy Lord is witness unto what I say. We testify that that which wakened thee was not their cry, but the prompting of thine own passions. For we tested thee and found thee wanting. Because what he was saying here was, look, we know what you said to the king of Russia. You did not start the Crimean War to protect the Catholic Church. You did not start the Crimean War to protect those who were oppressed. You started the Crimean War for your own selfish interest. That's what Baha'u'llah was saying here. I know your heart. You did not do this for the good of anyone other than yourself. And you will be judged for what you did right there. Because you started a war that killed 750,000 people for no reason. Part 3. Arise and make amends for what they had, for that which escaped thee, ere along the world and all that thou possessest. Cherish and thou shalt cherish, and the kingdom the kingdom shall remain unto God, thy Lord and the Lord of thy fathers of old. It behooveth thee to conduct thine affairs to the dictates of thine desires. For what thou hast done, thy kingdom shall be thrown into confusion, and thine empire shall pass from thy hands as punishment for which thou hast wrought. So the saying here is, you need to make amends for what you did. You started this Crimean War for no reason. You started a war in Mexico for no reason. You're just doing all this based off of whims. You need to make amends for what you're doing, and you need to stop doing this based off of whims. If you continue down this path, you will be overthrown. And so, here's what Napoleon III would do off of whims. His failed attempts at power, when he decided to wave the Italian flag and march down the streets of Rome. His first 2 coup attempts, very little planning went into them. He just used and discarded women, because as I said, assume at every point he has mysticisms having affairs. He would just use the women and discard them immediately afterwards. He just spent so much money because he kept going to the French legislature wanting more and more money, and they're telling him, no, we're not going to give it to you. And then when he became emperor of France, he just kept spending and spending and spending. He censored books and the press was critical of him because he didn't want anyone criticizing him. The wars have already gone over. He just based all that off of whims. And then he would say, not my fault. And even those closest to him would say that Napoleon III was a born schemer. So Napoleon is saying, you need to knock this off. Stop doing everything off of whims. Otherwise, your kingdom is going to be taken from your hands. And he goes on to say, then thou will know that thou hast plainly erred. Commotion shall seize all the people in that land, unless thou risest to help the cause and followest him who is the Spirit of God, Jesus Christ, in this straight path. Hath thy pomp made thee proud? By my life, it shall not endure. Nay, it shall soon pass away, unless thou holdest fast by this firm cord. So he's saying here is, if you continue this path, you will be overthrown. And when you're overthrown, your arrogance is going to come back to haunt you. So you need to stop doing things off of whim and turn to my teachings. That's how you're going to keep your empire. If you do not do this, you will be overthrown. And this brings us to the Austro-Prussian War. Because Bismarck, he was the Prince Chancellor of Germany at the time. He met with Napoleon III and agreed to give Venice to Italy in exchange for France's neutrality. No benefit was to France for this other than his whim, because, as I said, Napoleon III was a romantic revolutionary and he supported Italian independence. Plus, Napoleon III fought Austria in Italy. So Prussia, or Germany, said, if you we will deal with Austria if you stay neutral. And he agreed, because many people thought that Austria was going to win this war, which Austria did not win the war. Prussia won the war, which shocked a lot of people. So in the immediate aftermath, a lot of Napoleon's III's advisors came to him and said, we need to deal with Prussia. They are going to come for you next. Well, we need to invade Prussia right now while their army's in Austria. But Napoleon III decided he didn't want to. As I said, he was doing everything based off of a whim. And so he decided that he's not going to fight Prussia. Well, as I said, he did everything off of a whim, and he changed his mind. Bismarck, the Prince Chancellor of Germany, provoked France into a war. What he did is he sent a letter to France. It had a dual meaning to it. On one hand, it wasn't insulting to France, but if you knew how to read into it, it was insulting. And a lot of people in France decided that this was an insult to the honor of their nation. And based off the leadership of Napoleon III, many people in France thought that France had an outdated, disorganized military. And so here's where the problem came in. Napoleon III decided that he was going to lead the French army against the Prussian army. And even though a lot of the French military was outdated and disorganized, most French believed that their military was the strongest in Europe. And so what the French are doing is they were chanting "To Berlin" at the start of the war. Now the French are getting ready to go to war with the Prussians or Germany. And France mobilized 2 million soldiers for the war, and Prussia mobilized 1.5 million people for the war. And this was the start of the Franco-Prussian War, and Napoleon III was leading the offensive into modern-day Germany against the war. And here's how the war turned out. We're going to watch a day by day of the Franco-Prussian War here. So here we go. All right, so we can see there that France lost this war really badly. So in the aftermath of the war, Napoleon III was captured at the Battle of Sedan. After he was captured, his wife just said, why couldn't he have killed himself? And Napoleon III, his last words were at the end of about the Battle of Sedan, what cowards we were out there. I don't know what this we thing is he's talking about, because no, his military fought and died for him. He was the coward there. There was no we in there that was the coward. And all that cowards rest solely on him. Now, in the aftermath of this of the Franco-Prussian War, the Second French Empire collapsed. This was the start of the Third French Republic. Germany was formed as a country. The Papal States, which were dependent on the French military for independence, was annexed. The Kingdom of Italy was formed, and Russia and Austria continued to decline. So there were some enormous repercussions to this. Daniel 7 verse 4 says, the first was like a lion and it had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. It had wings of an eagle because that was the Napoleonic eagle, and that was the symbol of the French Empire. The wings, it came from a lion until it was torn off because Napoleon III planned his coups from Great Britain, and the symbol of Great Britain is the lion. And that's where he must stage his coups to take over France from. That's why that's born from a lion and it's torn off. And it was given the mind of a human because it was Napoleon III. It wasn't godly. It was something of human, of his ego. So that's the symbolism behind the first beast there. And this is where we come to the second beast, which is going to be Germany. Now, if you want to take a break, this is a really good spot to pause and take a break for a while. Otherwise, I'm just going to continue on to the next beast. Now, it says in Daniel chapter 7, verse 5, and there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised on one of its sides and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. And behold, his letter to him, the Kaiser says, O King of Berlin, give ear unto the voice calling from this manifest temple. Verily, there is none other but me, the everlasting, the peerless, the Ancient of Days. Here, we see the phrase Ancient of Days showing up. That's how we know that this is one of the 4 kingdoms. And so let's get the symbolism behind there. The Berlin coat of arms is the bear. And he says, O King of Berlin. That's how we know we're dealing with Germany here, because the symbol of Berlin was a bear, and we have a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. Those are the 3 Reichs of Germany, because Germany had its 3 Reichs. And it says, get up and eat your fill of flesh. And these are going to be all the wars that Germany fought during the 1800s and 1900s, and we're going to get into them individually. So the First Reich. The First Reich was known as the Holy Roman Empire. Now, it's kind of an oxymoron in its name because it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. So it's kind of an oxymoron. But the First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire. It was founded by Emperor Charlemagne in the year 800 AD. And Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as emperor. And the Holy Roman Empire lasted for 1,006 years and was dissolved by Napoleon I in the year 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars. And here's the Holy Roman Empire at the height of its power. It basically stretched from Rome all the way to Denmark. Then it has vassals from modern day France all the way to modern day Russia and Poland. So at the height of its power, it was a very vast empire. However, by the time Napoleon I dissolved it in the year 1806, it really wasn't even an empire anymore. It it had absolutely no influence. It was influenced in name only. So when Napoleon I dissolved it, it was really of no consequence to European affairs. So after Napoleon I dissolved it, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Germany was just a confederation. Because here's a map of Germany soon after the Napoleonic Wars. Notice there is no Germany. It's a collection of warring countries, because the most dominant one was the Kingdom of Prussia. And then it was surrounded by like the Kingdom of France. Austria was still an empire. Russia was still an empire. They controlled Poland. And then as the Kingdom of Prussia, being the dominant German city-state, it wasn't a country. You had like the Kingdom of Bavaria, the Kingdom of Hanover. Again, just a bunch of warring states where each had their own loyalties, and some were loyal to Austria, some were loyal to Prussia, some were loyal to France. It was not an empire to it. And so this is when we start to see the 1848 European revolutions coming in, because the 1848 revolution deposed the French monarchy, which led to the French Republic, which led to Napoleon III coming to power. Now we're coming over to the 1848 revolution and how it affected Germany. Now, technically there was no Germany. It was Prussia with the kingdoms, but I'm going to be using a few of those words interchangeably. But just know it was not Germany just yet. Now, there was large-scale discontent with Germany in the autocratic states at the time, because many wanted democracy, some wanted a unified Germany, others didn't want a unified Germany. So it wasn't they did not have a cohesive nation. And so many of the German liberals began clashing with the Prussian military in the streets, wanting a democracy, wanting a unified Germany. However, while in France they were successful in deposing of the French monarchy, in Germany they were not successful in deposing of the monarchy and creating a unified Germany. The German revolutions failed, and the autocrats continued to lead Germany under the Prussian monarchy. However, it was not a total failure, because the German Confederation was dissolved and a liberal constitution was adopted, so it created a constitutional monarchy. So it didn't get the same results that France had. However, they did get some concessions out of there. So they are beginning to move towards more of a democracy. And this is where we get Otto von Bismarck. He's the Prince of Germany, and he's also a chancellor. Because remember, from the last part, he's the one who made the deal with Napoleon III. Here's what he said about German unification. The position of Prussia, now remember, Prussia was its own independent country and they're the dominant country in Germany. Prussia and Russia are different countries. We'll make sure that's clear. He said, the position of Prussia in Germany will not be determined by its liberalism, but by its power. Prussia must concentrate its strength and hold it for the favorable moment, which has already come and gone several times. Since the treaties of Vienna, our frontiers have been ill-designed for a healthy body politic. Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by blood and iron, Einstein und Blut in German. Because he's saying right here, we are not going to unite Germany through democracy. We're not going to unite it through debate and votes. We are going to unite Germany behind Prussian military power. Because anybody who knows anything about Prussia, one thing that Prussia was very famous for was their military. I mean, here's just a few quotes from Prussia, from Prussian leaders and like a French Enlightenment writer. First one, Karl von Clausewitz, he was a Prussian military theorist. He said, war is an extension of politics. Because they viewed war, because most people viewed war and politics as separate. The Prussians said, no, war is part of politics because we have a very powerful military. So it's like, okay, we'll go to war, no big deal. The French Enlightenment writer, he said regarding Prussia, for some states have an army, the Prussian army has a state. Because like in America, we have America, but we have civilian oversight of the American military. And many other countries are the same way. The militaries are subordinate to the state. But Prussia was not that way. The state was subordinate to the Prussian military because the Prussian military ran the state and they're loyal to the monarchy. And so the Prussian military was what dominated Prussian politics. And then Frederick the Great, one of the leaders of Prussia, he said, diplomacy without military might is like music without instruments. And another quote from him, God is always on the side of the strongest battalions. So the Prussia was known very heavily for its militarism. Even Napoleon I, who's probably arguably the greatest military mind ever, even he was very cautious about going after Prussia during his time, because even he had to take a lot of counsel. They really had to do a lot of planning before they went after Prussia, because even they're like, don't know if you want to go after the Prussian military here. However, as you saw, he was able to overcome the Prussian military. But what I'm trying to draw here is, well, what Bismarck decided was, we're not going to use democracy and liberalism to unite Germany. We are going to use what we are very well known for here, and that is our military. And that's how we're going to unite Germany. That's what his speech said right there. And so, now begins the German Wars and Unification. We're starting for the Second Schleswig War. This began over a secession dispute when the King of Denmark passed away, and he did not have an acceptable heir to the German Confederation, meaning they just wanted to use their German military to begin taking over some of those German independent countries and begin coalescing them under Prussia. And so what happened here was Prussian and Austrian forces gained up on Denmark. And the result of this war is Denmark surrendered Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg to Prussia. And what we're going to show right here, and this is going to be day by day of the Second Schleswig War. So here we go. All right, this is the Second Schleswig War. As we see, Prussia went up into Denmark and they began reclaiming parts of Denmark, and they also reclaimed claimed some of the German independent countries. So, after the Second Schleswig War, German nationalism was on the rise and uniting behind the Prussian military. Now, Austria still had very large claims over some of the German states, and some of the German states were on side with Austria. So, Prussia and Bismarck, they knew that if they were going to unite Germany, they were going to have to fight Austria eventually. And so this is when Bismarck went to Napoleon III and got Napoleon III to agree that France will stay neutral in the Austro-Prussian War. And so Napoleon III and many people thought that Austria was going to win this war over the Prussians. So so the deal that Napoleon III signed was, okay, we will help them. We'll agree to give them parts of Italy to the Italians and take away from the Austrians, and we'll stay neutral. We don't care. And so this gave Prussia the opportunity that they needed to go after Austria. And as I said, many people thought that Austria was going to win this war, and this became known as the 7 Weeks' War. However, this shocked a lot of people when the Prussians won this war. And in the aftermath of this war, this is when the North German Confederation was formed, because Germany was still not fully united as a country by this point. And so what we're going to watch here is we're going to watch a day by day of the Austro-Prussian War. It said, Eat Your Fill of Flesh, Part 2. All right, so this is a little bit shorter of war, but you see, Germany is slowly uniting as a country, but behind Prussian military power, exactly as Bismarck said it would. And this brings us to the next war. This is the Franco-Prussian War, because this is when Bismarck provoked Napoleon III into declaring war on him. And this is what led to the downfall of the Second French Empire. And as the aftermath of this war, that Germany was formed, because Bismarck wanted South Germany. So he used he basically made sure that France declared war on them to unite the Germans against the French. And so this is led to the Franco-Prussian War, which, as you saw in the last part, led to the downfall of Napoleon III. In the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War, this is when Germany was united as a country. Now, I already showed you that video from part 1. I'm not going to show you the video again. But in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War, this is when the Second Reich of Germany was formed, and Germany was united as a country. Because now we see how much land Germany controls. For the first time in its history, since the Holy Roman Empire, it is now united. And but Germany, they began expanding their nation, because what they did is they united behind Prussian military power. So the Germans wielded the dominant military and dominant army in all of Europe. And they knew if they wanted to expand their empire, they needed to start expanding overseas. So they began colonizing territory in Africa and Asia. Now, when most people think of colonialism, they think of like France and Great Britain, and like Denmark and the Netherlands. But that is not true, because Germany also had colonies in Africa and Asia. To Germany, to the Kaiser, the King of Germany. He says, "Do thou remember the one whose power transcended thy power, Napoleon III, and whose station excelled thy station? Where is he? Whither are gone the things he possessed? Take warning, and be not of them that are fast asleep. He it was who cast the tablets of God behind him, when we made known unto him what the hosts of tyranny caused us to suffer. Wherefore disgrace assailed him from all sides, and he went down in great loss." Because what the Baha'u'llah is saying here is, do you remember what happened to Napoleon III? He became very arrogant. He did not listen to me, and he began to reach beyond that which his power enabled him to. And what happened to him? You are the ones who overthrew Napoleon III. You need to learn from what happened to Napoleon III. Otherwise, what happened to Napoleon III is what's going to happen to you. So remember, it was the Germans who overthrew Napoleon III, and they need to learn from his lesson. So, part 2 of the letter. Think deeply, O king, concerning him, and concerning them who, like unto thee, have conquered cities and ruled over men. The All-Merciful brought them down from their palaces to their graves. Be warned, be of them who reflect, O banks of the Rhine. We have seen you covered in gore, inasmuch as the swords of retribution were drawn against you. You shall have another turn, and we hear the lamentations of Berlin, though she may be today inconspicuous of glory. Because when he says the conquered cities and ruled over men, he's referring to all those independent German countries that the Prussian military overthrew and brought into unified Germany behind Prussian military power. So you overthrew Napoleon III. You overthrew all these kings in the independent German countries and overthrew them from their palaces. You need to take heed from them. If you are not careful, you are going to have the same thing happen to you. And this is where behold goes into prophecy. O banks of the Rhine, we have seen you covered in gore, inasmuch as the swords of retribution were drawn against you. You shall have another turn. Because they're covered in gore during the Franco-Prussian War. That was the war between Germany and France with Napoleon III, where Napoleon III was deposed of. You shall have another turn. That's World War I right there. And we hear the lamentations of Berlin. That's World War II, when the Soviet forces entered Berlin in 1945, though she today be inconspicuous glory. Because as I said, Germany was the dominant power in Europe, them and Great Britain. Those were the two dominant ones in Europe at the time. You are a very great nation. They had the strongest military, the strongest economy, and they're building a navy that could rival that of Great Britain. But what's going to happen to you is you are going to be cast down just like Napoleon III was cast down. And this is exactly what we see happen. Now, this is where we come to the Battle of Armageddon. Revelation 16, it says, look, I come like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and remains clothed, so as not to go naked and be shamefully exposed. Then they gathered the kings together to a place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne saying, it is done. Baha'i, remember, he's the Paul equivalent. He said in October 1912 at Leiden Stanford University, we are on the eve of the Battle of Armageddon, referred to in the 16th chapter of Revelation. In the time is 2 years hence, when only a small spark will set aflame the whole of Europe. Social unrest in all countries, the growing religious skepticism, antecedent to the millennium, and already here will set aflame the whole of Europe, as the prophecies in the books of Daniel and Revelation. By 1917, the kingdoms will fall and cataclysms will rock the earth. And 2 years later, that was the start of World War I. And by 1917 is when the first kingdom, the Russian monarchy, fell. And World War I was sparked by the assassination of the Archduke of Austria by Serbian nationalists. And here, Eat Your Fill of Flesh Part 4. This is going to be the day by day of my World War I. And so, here we go. Oh, and one thing to point out, I skipped part 3 because part 3 was the Franco-Prussian War, which we already saw in part 1 of our presentation. So that's why I jumped from Eat Your Fill of Flesh part 2 to part 4. So here's World War I, day by day.
taken to realize the magnitude of the war in which we are involved.
Рабочей крестьянской революции, по необходимости которой в то время говорили большевики, совершилась. Iniziò il 24 maggio 1915 e con sede incrollabile tenace valore condusse ininterrotta ed asprissima per 41 mesi e vinta.
All right, so that was Battle of Armageddon right there, which is World War I. And that war, 20 million people died in that war. And so what happened in Germany in the aftermath of World War I, this is the coming of the Weimar Republic here, in which they attempted to set up a democracy. Now, here's the German perspective. I'm not saying I 100% agree with it, but I'm giving you the German perspective here. Because Germans believed the Allies started the war, because Germany took the first shot in the war, and they did the first military offensive. But World War I started when the Serbian nationalists, because the Serbs were part of the Allies, assassinated the Archduke of Austria, who was part of the Central Powers. So the Germans said, hey, we didn't start this war. You started the war. And then if you notice how much land like the Ottomans, the Austrians, and the Germans controlled during that time. So after the Germans surrendered, it's like, why did we surrender? So what became the very dominant theme in Germany in the aftermath was we weren't defeated militarily. We were betrayed on the home front. That's why we lost the war, which is where the stab in the back theory came from in the aftermath of World War I. Then also in the aftermath was the Treaty of Versailles. And this was just an enormous insult to the Germans, because France basically wanted to just destroy Germany, because France was mad at the Germans for the Franco-Prussian War. So many French died in World War I. And so they wanted to really stick it to the Germans as much as they could. But like a lot of the British and the Americans wouldn't let them as much as they wanted. So the Treaty of Versailles stated that Germany must accept all responsibility for the war, and they must pay the Allies reparations for the war, which the Germans are saying, we didn't start that war. And why would we have to pay reparations? They didn't want to. So this was so Germany was, with how World War I came to an end, Germany was furious in the aftermath. And then close after the aftermath in 1919, the communists attempted to overthrow the Weimar Republic and set up a communist revolution and set up a communist government in Germany. But it was stopped because a lot of former army units, well, what they did is in the aftermath of World War I, they're like, we've been soldiers all our lives. We fought wars. What do? They just started forming their own individual militias, not under control of the Weimar Republic. And so you had like the Free Corps who were fighting back against the communists, attempting to set up a communist government. And so plus hyperinflation just devastated the German economy. And just to the point where if you ever wanted to go shopping, to buy a loaf of bread, you would bring a wheelbarrow full of money because German money became worthless. I mean, there were stories about what Germans would do is they'd get their paper money and they just use it as wallpaper because literally wallpaper was more valuable than German currency was. And there's also other stories where this German old lady, she goes to the store with a bucket full of money and then she would set the bucket full of money down trying to buy a loaf of bread. Well, then the kids just run up there, dump the money and take the bucket because the German money was worthless. So they just hit with massive inflation. So the reparations they were like giving the French afterwards meant literally nothing. So the French decided what they were going to do is they were going to go into Germany and start stealing the German industrial equipment. So they're still getting their value. So on top of their money being worthless, so many Germans in their industrial sectors were just losing their jobs. So it was forcing Germany just into a greater and greater depression. And the dominant party in Germany at the time was Social Democrats. They were still attempting to install a communist government in Germany. So Germany was just in a total disaster in the aftermath of World War I. And this was when an angry Bohemian corporal went home after the war full of anger and rage. His name was Adolf Hitler. Hitler wanted to form the Third Reich and was a very strong German nationalist. So they started forming the Nazi Party. So on one hand, you had the communists forming their own, trying to do a communist revolution, overthrow the Weimar Republic. On the other hand, you had the Nazis pulling it to the right, trying to attempting to form a Nazi government, form the Third Reich, and do a revolution. And the Weimar Republic and the German Republicans, they were just powerless to do anything about it. So Germany was just literally tearing itself to pieces during this time. And I just want to show you exactly what the hyperinflation did to Germany this time. Because the value of one gold coin, one gold mark in Germany at the start of 1918 was worth equivalent to, we'll just say $1, one gold mark. By 1923 was hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, 1 trillion. So imagine having one gold mark go from the value of $1 to 1 trillion. That was the hyperinflation that Germany was hit with. And here's a picture of somebody, he's just going shopping at a food store. He has to bring in a wheelbarrow full of money to push his money just to afford anything. It just wiped Germany out. Plus, about 1 million Germans died in World War I. They were very angry. It's like, imagine having 1 million of your people die and then have to surrender and then have to accept all responsibility of the war and pay your enemy reparations. It was just an insult to Germany. They were just so angry and devastated by what happened. And in the aftermath of like all the fighting between the communists, the Nazis, the French, the Weimar Republic, what came in the aftermath was the Third Reich. And this is where Adolf Hitler took power. And so by 1936, the Nazi Party was the only legal party in Germany by this time. And the Nazi ideology, it was based off the ideas of social Darwinism, eugenics, and German nationalism. And so basically what happened is Germany, they are based off of racial laws. So like the Aryan race, the French, the British, they were viewed as racially equal compared to everyone else. Races like the Jews, the Gypsies, the Poles, the Slavs, they were viewed as racially inferior. So based on where you stood under German law during the time, dictated based on how you're treated under German law. So people like the Aryan race, the French, the British, they're treated just fine. People like the Jews, the Gypsies, the Poles, the Slavs, they were treated as racially inferior. So later on in German history, that's where we start to see the Holocaust coming in, based on how these races were treated. Another thing they did is they began rearming the German military in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Because the Treaty of Versailles explicitly told the Germans exactly what they were allowed to have. But Hitler defied the Treaty of Versailles and he began rearming the military in direct violation to it. As I said earlier, he's beginning to form a lot of that, rebuild that Prussian military background to it. Because Germany, they wanted to basically avenge the Treaty of Versailles because they viewed that as a huge insult to the honor of the German country. So what Hitler started doing is he started basically making the plans to, one, avenge the Treaty of Versailles, and two, expanding expanding Germany to the east, reclaiming what they lost in World War I. And so little by little, Hitler was took him just reclaiming parts of it, Germany little by little. In 1938, September 1938, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain went to Germany, signed a peace treaty with Hitler, and this is his famous speech, "Peace in our time." Well, World War I broke out a year later. Sorry, World War II broke out a year later, so obviously it wasn't peace in our time. And so my Eat Your Fill Flesh Part 5, this is where we're going to get into this. So this is going to be World War II day by day.
Jetzt heute Morgen um 3 Uhr einberufen können. Zweite Organisation, Flugzeuge, Reichsstellung, Treffwagen, es ist gelungen, einen großen Teil der Abgeordneten rechtzeitig heranzubringen. December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. Der Kampf um die rote Wolga-Metropole. Schutzwaffe zerhämmert zu pausenlosen Einsätzen und Widerstandsmännern. Zahllose verstehende Artillerie zermürbt den zehn verteidigten.
vergangener Zeit auf unfolgende Erwartung. Sehen Sie nur den Augenblick gekommen, um dieses im deutschen Volk sprechen zu können.
Great defeat in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground.
Товарищи, соотечественники и соотечественники, наступил Великий День Победы над Германией. Фашистская Германия, поставленная ногами Красной Армии и войсками наших союзников, признала себя побежденной и объявила безоговорочную капитуляцию.
All right, so World War II, in that war, 72 million people died. So between World War I and World War II, you had close to 100 million people dying. That's why that's the Battle of Armageddon. And so in the aftermath of World War II, that's when the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union began. Germany was split between East and West Germany, and it was reunited in 1991. Daniel 7 says, and there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. So the bear was a symbol of Berlin. The 3 ribs are the 3 Reichs. And get up and eat your fill of flesh is all the wars that took place. So there's your second beast. As Baha'u'llah said, you will be overthrown if you're not careful. And they were overthrown just like Napoleon III was. And that brings us to the third beast, which is going to be Queen Victoria in Great Britain. If you want to take a break, this is a good place to take a break at. Otherwise, I'll just continue on to this. So, for the third beast, after that, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back, it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. So, this is what I'm talking about Great Britain, because Baha'u'llah says, lay aside thy desire and set then thine heart towards thy Lord, the Ancient of Days. We see that phrase, the Ancient of Days, showing up again. That's how we know this is one of the beasts. And the 4 wings, 4 heads, it's the 4 areas of the United Kingdom. We got England, Scotland, and Ireland, which was united at the time with Queen Victoria, and Wales. There's your 4 right there. And it's a leopard because a lot of times the French referred to the United Kingdom as a leopard, and that was the symbol of London. So we have our symbolism right here. That's how we know this is one of the beasts. So Queen Victoria, we're going to be getting into her. She was born 24 May 1819. Now, she had a very, very rough relationship with her mother. They did not get along. She had one of those mothers who was very controlling, like to degrade her a lot. So they had a very rough relationship with each other. However, Queen Victoria became queen a month after turning 18 because many people were concerned that the current leader of the United Kingdom was going to pass away before she turned 18, so they'd be forced to go into a regency. They wouldn't, so they weren't. She turned 18 a month later, she's crowned Queen of England. She was actually very, very popular among the British during her time. So her reign began 20 June 1837. Now, the United Kingdom ended slavery in 1834, just a few years before Victoria became Queen of England. However, court scandals and her dealing with Prime Minister Melbourne damaged her reputation. Because one of the court scandal was she got into a dispute with one of the women there, and to be direct, she was effectively slut shaming one of the women, and the woman who was being shamed denied ever doing the accusations. The accusations proved false, and Queen Victoria later admitted that she had no idea what came over her, and that she was wrong to do to that woman. And then a lot of her dealings with Prime Minister Melbourne damaged her reputation with the opposing political party because she wouldn't work with the leader of the opposing political party, who was the prime minister. So she began to become off like very elitist, very arrogant. And then she also really heavily tended to micromanage her cabinet a lot because they weren't allowed to make a decision unless they first went through Queen Victoria and she approved of the decisions. And so since this whole dealing with like Prime Minister Melbourne, she also came off as very partisan because she supported the Whigs, and they were more of the elite party. So she, between these court scandals, becoming very elitist, very partisan, her approval ratings really began to heavily go down among the British. However, it did not stay this way. Because soon after she became queen, King Albert arrives. Now, he was not British, but since she's queen, she's expected to marry and start having children to continue the British monarchy. He was born in the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg, Saalfeld. That was in basically modern day Germany. Initially, Queen Victoria did not want to marry King Albert because she had a very negative view of marriage because just how rough a relationship she had with her mother. So plus she didn't want to lose her independence because she thought if she got married, she'd no longer be independent. So at first she did not want to marry King Albert. And however, she ended up marrying him. They eventually married, and they really struggled over who was in charge during their marriage. Because Queen Victoria, she wanted to be queen and she wanted to retain all the power and continue to make the decisions. King Albert, he had no intention of being sidelined. He was going to be King of England, whether she liked it or not. So initially, they really heavily struggled over who was in charge. Now, King Albert, he won out initially. He was able to basically sideline Queen Victoria. Well, sideline's a bad word. They found a way to work together, and Queen Victoria, they had 9 children together, and since while a woman's pregnant having children, she has a hard time doing both. So King Albert wanted the short term, but Queen Victoria, she had longevity. So they were able to get it worked out, and in the end, they actually began to make a very good team with each other, as we're going to see. Because on one hand, King Albert, he really focused on plans to lift people out of poverty, improving housing for the working classes. So really improving the individual, really improving the living style of the people. Queen Victoria, she really focused on individual compassion and reform movements. So about women's reforms movement and animal rights, stuff like that. And then the prime minister worked closely with the opposing political parties. So between the three of them, they had a very, very efficient government going, and things worked out very well for the British. And things were great. And whenever foreigners came into England, they were always in awe about how much the people loved Queen Victoria and the British monarchy. Because if you mind, back the French monarchy, they were overthrown. People weren't so supportive of the German monarchy. But when they come to England, people loved them. So foreigners, whenever they visited, were always in awe of this. And this is where we come to the 1848 year revolution, because this is when this is when the French monarchy was overthrown. The Germans adopted a constitutional monarchy, and liberalism really began to sweep Europe. And so Queen Victoria, she become very afraid that she was about to be overthrown. And she was obviously very appalled by all the violence that was taking place. Well, rather than like send out the military like what the Prussians did, or just ignore the people like what the French did, King Albert, he wanted to soothe the people and not use excessive force. So he wanted to address the grievances of the people while using minimal force to keep himself in power. So he was trying to soothe it over rather than take it head on. And long story short, it worked. But England, they had a lot of protests and there was violence that took place, but nothing near on the scale that happened in the rest of Europe. So England, they were largely spared from revolutions. But it also is worth mentioning in this slide that 1848 was a year that Ireland suffered their massive potato famine, and millions of Irish either were forced to leave the country or starved to death. So the Irish were very angry with the British during this time, but that is worth mentioning during this time. And we'll see how this plays effect later on. But as I said, the 1848 revolutions largely spared the British. So in the aftermath, coming to the year 1851, what King Albert wanted to do was he wanted to find a way to showcase the British power and to really create a new golden era and a new era for the British Empire. So what he decided to do was create the Great Exhibition. And this was in 1851. And this exhibition was so large, it would take 20 full working days for everyone to see, a symbol of British might. And this was so famous, over 5.5 months, 6 million people visited the Great Exhibition. And this Great Exhibition remained in place until 1936, when it was destroyed by a fire. But this was a really large event during this time and was very successful in showcasing the British Empire and the British military. And then soon after this is when we begin to come to the Crimean War. This is the war that Napoleon III started just for really no reason over who gets to hold a set of keys. And so the British they sided with the French and Ottomans against the Russian. And this was the war that 750,000 people died. Because Great Britain, they did not want the Russians taking territory in the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire was on its collapse during this time. So the British okayed military action, but the British generals sent their troops into battle with really no forward planning. And so in the 2.5 years, 23,000 British died in 2.5 years, and only about 4,000 died in combat. The rest of them died due to like disease, malnutrition, things like that. And even though this actually turned into a disaster for the British, Queen Victoria came out looking really good because she's doing everything she could to like take care of the wounded, take care of the widows, take care of the people whose husbands were gone fighting the wars. And they began to make great advances in like British in British medicine after this, because so many people died outside of combat. So even though this turned into disaster for the British, Queen Victoria still came out looking really good because she's very compassionate for the people who were affected by it. So it actually ended up working out in the end. And so her reign continues. Albert and Victoria continued to ensure necessities like clean water, clean air, and sanitation for the people. I mean, it wasn't all peaceful. There's a really big mutiny in British-controlled India, and Queen Victoria ordered the British military to deal with it. Queen Victoria, she was always appalled by violence and war, but she also knew that sometimes war and violence were necessary. You couldn't go with a straight pacifism, and she understood that. Also during this time, she also became very concerned about the ambitions of Napoleon III, and she increasingly viewed him as a very unreliable ally and really didn't depend on him for very much, and she was eventually proven right later on. And during this time, this is about when Albert and Victoria were at the height of their power. And Queen Victoria, even though she didn't want to marry Albert at first, she really began to just idolize him. It was also during this time that they became grandparents, and Victoria, she made sure she never missed anything important like anniversaries, birthdays, or holidays for anyone she cared about, or for Great Britain. So things are going very well in the reign by now. They're making a great team, and the British Empire is on the rise. However, King Albert, he passes away. Queen Victoria, she was a very sensitive person, so many did not want to tell her that King Albert was dying, and nobody had the heart to. However, King Albert, he passed away on 14 December 1861. And after King Albert passed away, Queen Victoria just went into a multi-year depression. This depression was so bad that many people were actually becoming very concerned about her mental health. Victoria, she wanted everyone in the British Empire to mourn King Albert like she mourned him, but that just wasn't going to happen. And this depression just went on for so long. It was just so severe. The public really just began to lose faith in Queen Victoria because she wasn't performing her duties as king. I'm sorry, performing duties as queen. And she just was, they were basically had absent monarchy just for years. And she began to snap out of it when in a carriage ride, the carriage broke down and she was nearly died in the accident. And that's really what began to snap her out of it, because she had to face the decision: do I want to die or do I want to live? And that's when she realized she doesn't actually want to die. So that's when she really began to come back from her depression that she was in. And then this is where you get to the next court scandal. This guy named John Brown. Because John Brown, he really began to help her during this time to bring her out of this depression. And Queen Victoria really heavily began to lean on him. However, they spent so much time together, people wondered if she found a new lover. And Victoria was just so enthralled with John Brown that she ordered statues to be built in honor of him. However, not everyone shared the same appeal for John Brown that she had. And actually, the royal family, after Queen Victoria passed away, destroyed all traces of John Brown. So you're going to see a few statues of him like erected in Great Britain that Queen Victoria ordered built, and you're going to see him show up in like other people's diaries, but Victoria's family destroyed all traces of him. So it's always kind of a question of what kind of a relationship was it between her and John Brown. It always is a very scandalous during her time. But between the carriage rides, between John Brown, 10 years had passed, she's beginning to become reawakening now, and she's really starting to take over as queen again. This time, Russia invaded the Ottoman Empire in 1871, so some of the wars continuing. She began passing the Reform Bill. She began working closely with the Prime Minister, and she also really began heavily focusing on raising living standards of the people of Great Britain. So, like the slums were replaced with new houses, measures were put in to encourage saving. The Factory Act of 1871 ensured that no child under 10 would be allowed to work. And between the ages of 10 to 14, they could only work half a day. And women were not allowed to work more than 56 hours a week. And so they're really starting to put in like workers' rights, women's rights, other types of rights. And this is what Victoria is really heavily focusing on. And things are really starting to look uphill for the British Empire. And then also, this is when the second Married Women's Property Rights of 1882 was passed. Because the first was in 1870, but it was only a minor victory, where women could stand for elections and school boards. But the 1882 was the next one, where women could rent, inherit, and own property. Women could represent themselves in courts, and they began won more rights for their children, divorces. So she's really starting to make men and women equal. She's also starting to deal with minority rights. Then John Brown passed away. In March 1883, Victoria was devastated again. And in the aftermath of John Brown passing away, Victoria ordered that she commissioned tie pins, busts, monuments, and statues of John Brown all be built in his honor. And she wanted to write a memoir for a private publication, but her advisors warned her against doing it. Because the thing about the reason she did all this is Victoria's fearful that many would think John Brown was just a servant, but he was much more than that, and the book is never published. But you get the question of how much more was it? That's always the question. And since the royal family destroyed all traces of John Brown, nobody knows for sure how much more it was. Now, if you want my personal opinion, I think it was platonic, because Queen Victoria idolized King Albert. I don't think she would turn on him. I think what happened was Queen Victoria had a very rough childhood with her parents, so she's naturally latched on to people who are kind of toxic. Because John Brown, he was always a drunk vulgar. So what happened was she naturally latched on to somebody who was like the parents she was raised with, which it was platonic, so which was what Victoria wanted, but it also fed John Brown's ego, which she was satisfied with. So even though it was a very unhealthy, scandalous relationship, I think it was platonic. But that's just my personal opinion. Feel free to disagree with me. And so this is where we come to the Irish, because I remember in 1848, the Irish had their Massasoit famine. And this is where the Prime Minister and Victoria really began to turn on each other. As Prime Minister Gladstone wanted to pacify Ireland and give them independence. Queen Victoria was like, why are you doing that? Because if the Irish get independence, that's going to break up the British Empire. I do not want the British Empire being broken up. So Prime Minister Gladstone and Queen Victoria just absolutely despise each other. In 1870, Gladstone passed laws saying that evicted tenants would be compensated. So it's about Irish, we began focusing on more Irish rights. Then in 1881, he introduced the Second Irish Land Act, allowing evicted tenants to apply for fair rent, fixed tenure, and I'm afraid to sell their lease. And he also supported home rule for the Irish, which Queen Victoria absolutely hated. And so basically how to handle Ireland, Queen Victoria and Gladstone are not seeing eye to eye with each other. They are getting very angry with each other. And so this is when Victoria and Gladstone really Victoria decided that she's going to hate Gladstone for the rest of his life. Because British soldiers were in Sudan at this point. General Charles George Gordon went to Sudan to fight for the British in the war. General Gordon refused to withdraw, and Queen Victoria wanted to send reinforcements to him. Prime Minister Gladstone decided that he was not going to send reinforcements, and General Gordon was killed by the Sudanese. Victoria was furious. I mean, furious isn't even the right word. She loathed Gladstone for the rest of his life. Never forgave him. Even after Gladstone passed away, Queen Victoria was not sad. She did not shed a tear. So how much she idolized King Albert, that's how much she hated Prime Minister Gladstone. And those two never reconciled with each other. So, and then as I said, Victoria had 9 children. And a lot of the children were married off to the royal houses of Europe. She had a daughter named Vicky, who was married to Germany's Prince Fritz. Vicky was the mother of Wilhelm II. Wilhelm II was a German Kaiser that took Germany into World War I. So World War I was literally Victoria's children and grandchildren all fighting each other, literally. And Vicky, she was very unpopular in Germany because Germany was much more male-dominated because it had that militarism to it. Plus, Vicky was born in Great Britain, so a lot of people really distrust her because she was British, not German, because they had a lot of German nationalism. Plus, Wilhelm II, he did not like his mother because Wilhelm II, he was born with a deformity in his hand, which he often resented. He often blamed his mother, Vicky, for that deformity. So when Wilhelm II passed away, Fritz was Kaiser for only 99 days, and Vicky was Queen of Germany for only 99 days with him. But things were getting so bad between Vicky and the German court that Victoria made him a trip to Germany just to stick up for Vicky. And then Queen Victoria met Bismarck. He was the Prince Chancellor. We've seen him in the last couple of parts. But those two went into a room and spoke to each other. They don't know what was said, but it came out. Bismarck said, "Mein Gott, that was a woman." And they actually gained a lot of respect for Vicky afterwards. And they were much nicer to Vicky afterwards. Until Wilhelm II, Kaiser became queen, and things just went bad for Vicky again. Because right after Kaiser became queen, he ordered that after Wilhelm II became Kaiser, the king, he ordered that Vicky's room be raided and made sure that she was not sending information secrets off to the British. So it was a very rough time in Germany for Vicky. And then you get to the next scandal in the court. Because first, because they had John Brown, who the royal family actually hated, and then Victoria became very fond of this guy from India, this British Indian, who's Muslim, named Abdul Karim, which was very scandalous during that time. And this is only 5 years after John Brown passed away, so she's kind of going to the same thing. So this is another scandal that another person she really latched onto. And in a book written by Julia Baird, the book's called Victoria the Queen, she says, "The case of Abdul Karim highlights her loyalty to her abhorrence to racism and her kindness, as well as her susceptibility to charm and her blinding need for intimacy." So she keeps getting all these court scandals going during her time. And so it was, of course, but during the set, they also can't demonstrate anything was out of the line as John Brown, but you always get the questions of what was actually going on, and nobody really knows. And then Queen Victoria, she passed away 22 January 1901. And she did not want to pass away because she was actively involved in being the British queen right up until the day she passed away. Because despite her falling into that multi-year depression, wanting to die after King Albert passed away, she did not want to pass away. And she was the longest serving monarch until year 2007. That's when the current Queen of England, Elizabeth VII, overtook that record. And people widely agree that Queen Victoria, she did many great things, but at the same time, she also had many faults. And so this is where we come to with Baha'u'llah's letter. It says, what Baha'u'llah wrote to Queen Victoria. We make mention of thee for the sake of God and the desire that thy name be exalted through thy remembrance of God, the creator of heaven and earth. He verily is the witness unto that which I say. We have been informed that thou hast forbidden the trading in slaves, both men and women. This verily is what God hath enjoyed in this wondrous revelation. God hath truly destined a reward for thee. Because of this, he verily will pay the doer of good his due recompense, were thou to follow what hath been sent unto thee by him who was the all-knowing, the all-informed. So he said that the British are being righteous and they will be rewarded because they are a righteous country. And he specifically labels in 1834 when the British banned slavery. And also he says, we have also heard that thou hast entrusted the reins of counsel into the hands of representatives of the people. Thou indeed hast done well, for thereby the foundation of the edifice of thine affairs will be strengthened, and the hearts of all that are beneath thy shadow, whether high or low, will be tranquilized. It behooveth them, however, to be trustworthy among his servants, and to regard themselves as the representatives of all that dwell on earth. This is what counseleth them. In this tablet, he who is the ruler, the all-wise, blessed is he that entereth the assembly for the sake of God, and judges between men with pure justice. He indeed is of the blissful. So he's saying, because one thing Queen Victoria did is the House of Commons, the people really gained a lot of power under Queen Victoria. She took care of the people a lot. And he said, this is what this is what you should be doing as a monarch, taking care of the people. So the letter to France, he condemned Napoleon III for only looking out for himself. The letter to Germany, he warned them not to start too many wars. In the letter to Great Britain here, he said, you are being righteous and you will be rewarded because of your righteousness. And Queen Victoria was the only monarch that responded to Baha'u'llah's letter. Queen Victoria responded, if this is of God, it will endure. If not, it can do no harm, because Baha'u'llah said righteous things and good things about the British. Eventually, Abdu'l-Baha, remember he's the Paul equivalent, he received the British knighthood for feeding the hungry in the Holy Land during World War I. And Victoria's granddaughter, Queen Marie of Romania, accepted the Baha'i faith, and she was the first world leader to accept it. So, the third beast, this is the symbolism behind it. After that, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. So remember, I worked with the symbolism of the British Empire. It was given authority to rule. Victoria reigned for 60 years. She was the longest serving British monarch until Elizabeth II. And the sun never set on the British Empire because here's a map of the British Empire. It spanned around the world. That's why it was given authority to rule. And there's a symbolism behind it. So we're going to conclude with the song, The Ancient of Days, and then we'll go to the review slide. Hope to see you again. Thanks.